1. The historicity of Jesus. Almost all skeptic scholars that study the antiquities accept that Jesus of Nazareth existed, had 12 disciples, and if the Gospels are always reliable, he claimed to be God, and also he died from crucifixion. These are considered historical facts, primarily his existence and crucifixion. His miracles are well attested by early sources, way too much to be considered an invention. The New Testament skeptic scholar, considered the greatest atheist skeptic, Bart Ehrman, made a book in response to mythicism. He acknowledges that Jesus existed and stands against mythicism, the belief that Jesus was a myth. Let's check some evidence outside of the Bible. We have the Pilate inscription, an inscription proving that Pontius Pilate existed as the prefect of Judea, as the Gospels say. The Pilate inscription is often considered authentic. It's not a church artifact, and it's accepted by most scholars. There are some people that deny its authenticity because it was found 2,000 years later, but by that logic, dinosaur fossils are also a forgery. Capture this. The dinosaurs got wiped out by the asteroid 66 million years ago. It takes around 10,000 years for fossils to form, yet the first dinosaur fossil was found in 1677. The fossils are a forgery. Just kidding, it might not be a fair comparison. I'm just saying that it's not the best objection to the Pilate inscription. The fossils were not something that will pass our eyesight in theory, but it's the same thing with the Pilate inscription. We also have other non-Christian evidence. Recently, I saw this picture of non-Christian testimonies that prove Jesus existed and could be evidence for what we believe about his life. This picture proves nothing, so I went deep in to see what they said. Let's start with Pliny the Younger. He supposedly said that Christ existed and Christians called him God. Let's see if that's what he actually said. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. You can find in Pliny, Letters 10, chapter 96 to 97. And about Phlegon, his works were preserved by quotations from authors who lived around the antiquities. As the picture says, Phlegon said that Jesus predicted the future with accuracy. Thales' works were also preserved by quotations, and Thales did mention the crucifixion and the earthquake on the day of the crucifixion. Marabar Serapion calls Jesus the wise king of the Jews, just as Jesus calls himself. Also says that he was killed by the Jews and started a new covenant. But about Suetonius, who referred to Jesus not as Christos, but as Christos. I think it's referring to Jesus because only one letter is wrong, and Jesus is the only historical figure we could think of when we read what he wrote. Caesar said awful things about Jesus Christ. He says that he had miraculous powers and that he claimed to be God. Now we can talk about Tacitus. Let's see what he said about Jesus. Tacitus said that Christians were persecuted by Romans for their faith, and that Christos, which means Christ in Latin, suffered the extreme penalty by Pontius Pilate. It doesn't only disprove mythicism, but also Islam, because Muslims believe that the Quran was written by Muhammad word for word from Allah and his revelations through Angel Gabriel. But the Quran states that Jesus never died. The objections against this passage and the very response to them will be on the screen. The objections to the fact that the Tacitus mentioned Jesus were rebutted by an atheist site called History for Atheists, created by Tim O'Neill, an Australian skeptic atheist who also interviewed Bart Ehrman on mythicism. Now, the final non-Christian source for Jesus will be mentioned later because it was a huge play for Christianity in this video. 2. Messianic prophecies. Around 700 BC, Prophet Micah named the small village of Bethlehem as the birthplace of the future promised ruler that will come out of there, and we can confirm that in Micah 5:2. Jesus fulfilled it and was born in Bethlehem. Even the Jewish religious leaders acknowledged Jesus out of that verse. He called the Messiah the ruler of Israel. In Jewish traditions, only the Messiah could be the ruler of the nation. There are hundreds of other prophecies that I don't even need to mention because the prophecies fulfilled are not even the pinpoint of this video. We know that Jesus fulfilled over 300 to over 400 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Peter Stoner, a well-known Christian writer and professor, calculated the odds of Jesus fulfilling at least 8 prophecies of the Old Testament. Your odds of winning the lottery are about 1 in 300 million. That's not even close to Jesus fulfilling only 8 specific prophecies in the Old Testament. The chances of this happening were 1 in 10 to the power of 17. Now the chances of Jesus fulfilling 48 prophecies from the Old Testament are 1 in 10 to the power of 157. Jesus didn't fulfill 8 or 48, he fulfilled over 300 to more than 400 prophecies. The book from the prophets and the poems with divine inspiration got it right. I think that God transmitted the message to them and they wrote. 3. Archaeological evidence for Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the message of the Old Testament was not changed, and the Bible we have now is nearly identical to the earliest Bible found. According to the Bible, Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat, as we can see in Genesis 8:4. We have the physical archaeological evidence for Noah's Ark in Ararat. We have this boat-shaped formation exactly in the mountains of Ararat that is around 550 feet long, and the Bible tells us in Genesis 6:15, "This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high." 1 cubit can vary. It can be a long cubit, a royal cubit, or a short cubit. It's a unit measurement used by ancient Hebrews, but clearly it was the long or royal cubit. A short cubit was used in their daily tasks, but not in huge boats. Noah very likely used a royal cubit, and 300 royal cubits are 550 feet, and not only because it wasn't convenient to use the short cubit, also the ark was really heavy, and that's why it left behind the formation. Let's analyze. A boat-shaped formation exactly 550 feet tall, exactly in the mountains of Ararat, and the experts who studied the formation concluded this. The reanalysis confirms what we suspected. These are not random shapes in the mud flow. The presence of hallways and room-like structures point to a man-made origin of the boat shape, John said. 4. C.S. Lewis trilemma. C.S. Lewis, the most influential apologist from the 20th century, created a trilemma. Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. But before revising these options, let's check the criticisms of this trilemma by liberal scholarship. Skeptics say that the trilemma logically follows, but only if the Gospels are always reliable, and that would mean that Jesus claimed to be God. They usually claim that the Gospels are a mix of facts and myths of Jesus' life, and liberal scholars usually argue that his trilemma lacks a response to this issue. But C.S. Lewis had a good response to these criticisms. You can pause to see his response. Anyway, in summary, the criticism is based on the bad assumption that if miracles were documented, it would mean that they are not historical, instead of giving a response that logically follows. I will try to approach this with a philosophical response. The designer of this universe was powerful enough to create this wonderful universe and to design it very amazingly. Therefore, when he was made flesh, he could perform miracles easily. But overall, the criticism goes like this. It is improbable that those miracles happened by their own definition. Therefore, we shall not consider them. But this, again, is a bad assumption. The miracles of Christ are not about chance, it's about whether he willed or not. He is God. It's about his will. So let's address this again. Jesus cannot be a liar because his life is documented as someone truthful. And anyway, if he still lied about who he was, lies have short legs. and mainly in his context. Because of his radical claims, he knew that he would face Roman crucifixion or something like that, and that's not something very desirable. If he was lying, when the priests asked him if he was the Messiah and the Son of God, he would find a way to keep safe, but instead he answered, "I am," and he never did anything to avoid punishment. Even though Jesus was not only God, but also a human that suffered. Okay, he wasn't a liar, but was he a lunatic? What he taught wasn't something a crazy man would teach. The influence he had until today is literally unmatchable, eternally known for his wisdom and called wise by every generation and religion. If he was misunderstood, for example, on the trial of his life, he will defend himself at all costs. But we know that he didn't. And also, the crazy speculations that maybe he was just a philosopher, a good moral teacher, or things like that don't make sense, since he made clear that he wasn't just a teacher. He blatantly claimed to be the Son of God and the Lord himself. But let's get back to the idea that the apostles for some reason invented that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. If that was true, the Jewish Pharisees and the modern Jews wouldn't hate and insult him for centuries. If he was just a good teacher, he wouldn't be crucified for preaching peace. But everyone claimed to be children of God. He did not mean in the way you think. Jesus didn't claim that he is a child of God. Jesus claimed to be the only Son of God, not in the biological sense or in the Christian sense of being a child of God. If you don't know the difference, a child of God is a way of saying that you accept Jesus Christ. Claim to be the only true Son of God is something unique. Being the Son of God means that Jesus is similar to the Father and they are from the same substance. It refers to his eternal role, divine identity, and his nature. Unlike what some new Christians think, Jesus did not become the Son of God when he became a human. The Son of God is the same thing as God the Son. Muslims also say that when Jesus called himself the King of the Jews, it was a political claim and not religious, since it was Pontius Pilate, a Gentile pagan, who condemned him to cross, and not the Jews. So Jesus didn't really make radical religious claims the way we think. But this objection has a flaw. It makes us think that Jesus was crucified because Pilate didn't like his political claims, because he supposedly wanted to be called the King of the Jews instead of Jesus. But to prove that it was a religious claim is that Jesus went to 2 trials. On the Jewish trial, Jesus was considered a blasphemer and was condemned guilty by the Jews. While in the Roman trial, Jesus was considered innocent by Pilate, but he was under political pressure by the Jews, and he decided to please the Jews and crucify Jesus. Jesus cannot be a liar. Jesus cannot be a lunatic. Therefore, he must be God. 5. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the best argument so far in my opinion. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the event that proves the totality of Christianity. For example, the Holy Trinity, the virgin birth, the flood, the existence of Adam and Eve, the doctrine that Jesus is the Messiah, the crucifixion as a sacrifice for our sins, Christology, the resurrection and the ascension itself, and the total trust in the Bible. Premise 1. Jesus is the confirmation to all Christian doctrines. Premise 2. Jesus prophesied a confirmation to his saints, which was going to be his bodily resurrection from the dead, as we can see in Matthew 12:40, Matthew 16:21, Mark 8:31, Luke 9:22, and John 2 verses 18 and 22. Premise 3. As we will see, Jesus fulfilled and was raised from the dead. Conclusion: Christianity is true. Embarrassing detail. When you want a major lie to spread all over the world from Judea in the 1st century, you will not bring women to give their testimony. In the 1st century, women's testimony was never accepted or at least taken seriously by the Jews. Women were the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection. We can confirm this in the Gospels. The Jewish historian from the 1st century, Flavius Josephus, in his book called The Antiquities of the Jews, confirms that the Jewish culture at that time didn't accept women's eyewitness testimony in Book 4, section 219. Let the testimony of women not be accepted because of the levity and boldness of their gender. It assures that it's unlikely that they were preaching something they knew was false, since they would have to make a forgery with a group of people whose testimony would not be accepted. It's more likely that it was not made up that the apostles tried to spread over the world. The sudden explosion of Christianity. I will rely on the sociologist Rodney Stark in his book Rise of Christianity that was written 1 decade before his conversion to Christianity. Stark was agnostic when he wrote the book, so there is no quote-unquote religious bias that could worry you. He admitted that the rise of the Christian faith skyrocketed after a shameful death. We even have some stats. Remember that in 30 AD, before the time that the resurrection was supposed to happen, there were only 20 Christians. But as you can see, it skyrocketed. And if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, the last thing that happened to him was his crucifixion, which is a historical fact. So, in this case, after the shameful death of a man who was considered a crazy blasphemer, Christianity was supposed to be done as soon as Jesus died. All of his disciples abandoned him when he was on the cross because of their fear, except for Our Lady and John the Apostle. Conversion happening at a rate that high should have a greater explanation than nothing happened after his death that was supposed to be the end. Christianity was gaining a huge place that concerned the Roman Empire. We are talking about a religion that, after those sudden 3 days after the public humiliation, something happened. There were millions of Christians before Christianity was even legal in 330 AD. Conversion of the enemies. Before Paul saw Jesus risen, Paul was named Saul. He was a devout Roman Jew that persecuted Christians. He wasn't part of the original 12 disciples. In fact, he opposed them. His transformation was completely out of the normal. Once he persecuted Christians, another day he preached about the resurrection of Jesus and everything he saw by his own eyes. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:14, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith," says the man who preached about Christ. Not for something that he was personally convicted like I am, but for something he saw. James, Jesus' half-brother, also saw the risen Christ. And after Jesus' skeptic brother saw his own brother Jesus coming back from life, he radically converted to Christianity. It's documented also by Paul, who knew James. From a skeptic that called Jesus crazy before those sudden 3 days, to a radical Christian preacher, the leader of the Jerusalem church, and an author of a canonized book in the Bible, the letter of James. That's not the type of stuff that happens to a lie. A lot of people claim to see it and bringing embarrassing false testimony. Martyrdom of the Apostles. When Christ was crucified, only John the Apostle, Our Lady, and Mary Magdalene didn't leave him. 3 days before the resurrection, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. All his other disciples left him that day. Saul of Tarsus and James were his enemies. But after that day, everything changed. Saul of Tarsus became Paul the Apostle, and instead of persecuting, he became the persecuted. He preached about the gospel and what he saw with his own eyes. He was imprisoned for that, wrote 4 letters in prison, and showed no fear when he was in jail, as we can confirm in his letters written in prison. Philippians 1:21-23 and Philippians 2:17. This former enemy of Christ was not only imprisoned, but he also died as a martyr for his own belief in the resurrection based on his eyewitness of the risen God the Son after the day of the crucifixion. He was beheaded in Rome for the resurrection. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, died for him after seeing him alive once again. He ate fish with him and talked with him. Not only Peter, but also other disciples. Anyway, it would make sense to believe that it's logical to doubt these stories, but Peter died on the upside down cross after preaching about the resurrection. He will not die for a claim that he knows is false, since he reported it as seen by his own eyes. As far as I know, we all know what we see, right? I do know that I never saw Obama in person. Skeptics usually accept Peter's martyrdom as true and his death under Nero for the resurrection. We already have the disciple that denied Jesus 3 times choosing to die for the resurrection. The former enemy of Christ and persecutor of Christians choosing to die beheaded because he knew the resurrection is not a lie. I forgot about James. I only said that James radically converted. He was a skeptic who called Jesus insane, but after witnessing the resurrection with his own eyes, he converted, became the leader of Jerusalem church, preacher of the resurrection, and a martyr because he died for the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. We also have Thomas, the most skeptical disciple. When the disciples claimed that Jesus was raised from the dead, he said he would only believe if he saw it with his own eyes and touched Jesus' crucifixion wounds, just to assure that the risen one is Jesus Christ. Guess what? He was also martyred. These accounts are from other disciples who eyewitnessed the fullness of the stories together. We also have James, the son of Zebedee, who also witnessed the resurrection and died as a martyr. No one willingly dies for something they know it's a lie. The resurrection cannot be false. Of course, we have this objection that is very commonly used. But radical Islamists also explode themselves because of their faith. Does that mean that Islam is true? Now apply the same logic to the resurrection of Jesus. The great problem of this is that the Islamic self-martyrdom is based on their personal conviction. Blowing yourself off is something crazy and extraordinary to do. The point is not that Saul heard the message of Jesus Christ and decided to die because of it, or that Peter heard that Jesus is risen. It's not that. The point is that they are dying for the resurrection, and the resurrection is something that they claim to witness with their own eyes. They had the fullness of the empirical proof in front of them. If they lied about the appearances of Jesus, they would know that Christianity is false. They will be martyred for something that they knew that was false, and they will suffer a lot, be persecuted, imprisoned, lose their lives, go to the cross upside down. Another objection is that these were all hallucinations, but 500 people got this vivid hallucination at the same time. Okay, we cannot confirm the 500 witness claim, but we can surely confirm that the disciples and the former enemies of Christ claimed to see the risen Son of God, and also not just because we can't confirm it that it's not true. He was there in the context. Thomas even felt his crucifixion wounds, and the disciples ate fish with Jesus. There is no other comparison possible where that amount of non-family members had the same vivid grieving hallucination where they could even feel him physically. There is nothing you could compare this to if you want to call it a hallucination. Don't even say that Paul lied about the 500, because that's just an assumption. And the 500 claim is not very relevant to prove it, because I have better points. The resurrection rumors spread very quickly, and tens of Christians became tens of thousands, spread among a lot of different families and cities. Again, 500 witnesses is a good number to explain the seed of explosion of the Christian faith in the 1st century. Clement first lived in Rome and was around his 30 years of age when Paul and Peter willingly died for the resurrection. In the first epistle of Clement, written possibly only 30 years after St. Paul and St. Peter died as martyrs, probably only written later because his papacy only started in 88 AD. He wasn't heard by Christians before becoming the Pope, and it's considered likely that Clement witnessed the event because he also knew the apostles, and the first epistle of Clement is considered a testimony for its detail. Let's read what's written. We see in chapter 5 verse 4 to chapter 6 verse 1 of the letter. Peter, through unjust envy, endured not one or two but many labors, and at last, having delivered his testimony, departed unto the place of glory due to him. Through envy Paul, too, showed by example the price that is given to patience. Was he cast into chains? He was banished, he was stoned, having become a herald both in the east and in the west. He obtained the noble renown due to his faith, and having preached righteousness to the whole world, and having come to the extremity of the west, and having borne witness before rulers, he departed at length out of the world, and went to the holy place, having become the greatest example of patience. To these men who walked in holiness there was gathered a great multitude of the elect, who, having suffered through envy many insults and tortures, became a most excellent example among us. I think it's very unlikely that St. Peter, who had a family to worry about, had a grieving hallucination of a man who didn't show him any striking proof, supposedly. It's even less likely that Paul had a grieving hallucination. When Jesus was crucified, Paul thought that it was proof that Jesus was a false prophet, and he was born and raised in a strict Jewish background and lived his life completely hostile to Jesus before his conversion. When someone dies, the most likely hypothesis is that nothing happens. A grieving hallucination from a family member is already unlikely, let alone a non-family member, physical experiences and with multiple independent people attesting. Now, since the martyrdom of the apostles is related to the appearances of the risen Jesus Christ, I will address an alternative theory to the appearances of Jesus. I will talk about the impersonator theory now. This alternative theory implies that a twin or lookalike to Jesus appeared to the disciples to fool them and to make them think that Jesus was raised from the dead, and there are people who actually stick with this theory. I have to admit this, for a couple hours I thought this was a good theory, and it's at least the best alternative theory. It really fails to explain how this impostor could fool the disciples for 40 days straight and perform many miracles in front of the disciples. And finally, to explain how could the impostor perfectly mimic the crucifixion wounds, and how could the disciples feel the fake crucifixion wounds. The disciples were personal fellows of Jesus Christ for more than 3 years. It's really improbable that they were fooled by a lookalike. As we have already seen, the disciples were skeptic before Jesus appeared to them. Therefore, they would be difficult to fool. Also, Jesus appeared to extreme skeptics, James and Paul, which makes it really much harder to fool and make them believe. And nothing before or after the crucifixion seemed to make them more open to the faith. The apostles suffered for their belief in the resurrection. They genuinely risked martyrdom for their belief. Consequently, they were martyred for their belief. But what do I mean with apostles? Specifically, St. Peter, Paul, James the son of Zebedee, Thomas, Philip, Bartholomew, James the Just, Matthew, Simon the Zealot, and Matthias. The Apostle John was willing to be martyred, and he suffered for the resurrection. Fortunately, he could endure the persecution. The book of Acts is the only book that mentions the apostles preaching about the resurrection, yet it doesn't mention the martyrdom of the apostles. In Acts chapter 2, we see Peter preaching the resurrection to the Jews. First, let's notice why is the book of Acts reliable. Secondly, we will understand why it lacks the martyrdom of the apostles, and then I will show you the evidence for the martyrdom of the apostles. Even Christians sometimes claim that we overtrust the church tradition. It is theoretically reasonable to trust the apostolic traditions to understand better what was going on with the apostles. First, the Book of Acts is considered finally historically and topographically accurate. Luke is a top-tier researcher, first-rank historian. He is very accurate and his methodology is appreciated nowadays. He had great knowledge and connection with the eyewitnesses. I know atheists will just assume that I trust Luke for history because I consider his book sacred. This is false. My concern is the huge historical quality of the Book of Acts when we talk about historical claims that are not even miraculous. Even if it was a historical documentation of a miracle, it will not be reasonable to just dismiss it. I do not trust Muhammad about the cave story because no one else witnessed and he did not even suffer for this story. Secondly, it's very likely that the Book of Acts was written before Paul and Peter died, and the Book of Acts records the death of James, the son of Zebedee. History relies on oral tradition. Now, the early church kept the tradition of how the apostles were martyred, but we can't confirm it with other methods. Josephus confirms the stoning of James, the half-brother of Jesus. Saint Ignatius, linked to Peter and John, confirmed their martyrdom. Saint Polycarp, Papias, and Tertullian too. It is a fact that Peter and Paul claimed to witness the risen Christ and wrote about it. They were willing to suffer martyrdom because of it. Okay, we get it. They were martyrs for the belief that Jesus was raised from the dead. But that does not mean that he was raised from the dead. Let's answer this objection from the greatest skeptic, Bart Ehrman. First, Ehrman's claim is that we claim that all the apostles died for their faith. But that's wrong. We acknowledge that we are not sure if all of them did, but most of the eyewitnesses for the resurrection did. The second claims that people die for their beliefs all the time, and that does not mean that their belief is true. Ideals cannot be empirically proven to the 9/11 hijackers and people that died for their ideals. They died because of their personal conviction and not physical, empirical proof verified and attested by multiple people. My answer to A is, imagine a group of scientists that was composed by proposers and skeptics to the scientific hypothesis X. They get to the conclusion that the X hypothesis was true. They check the clearest empirical evidence, but the empirical evidence is stolen by anti-science thieves. Negationists go to the lab and then call them liars spreading lies in the name of their false science. They didn't find the empirical evidence, so they are called liars. They are in danger of martyrdom because the law is against false scientific claims.
Monster kill.
If scientists who were formerly skeptics against the hypothesis and the ones who embraced it died for the claim, I can trust them for sure, because if they were shown the clearest and the most undoubtful empirical evidence possible, or that was what they claimed, either they lied about the conclusion, were deceived about it, or they were right about their conclusion. They didn't lie because they were willing to die for their conclusion. They weren't deceived because they were the observers. The only option left is that hypothesis X is scientifically true. The difference between the appearances of the risen Jesus and the analysis of the physical scientific empirical proof is that I cannot think about anything clearer than the bodily risen Christ in your eyesight and feeling his crucifixion wounds. My answer to B is, Ehrman claims that they could genuinely believe that he rose from the dead without lying, but it was reported by people who met Peter. Paul reported himself, claiming to see the risen Jesus. Thomas, James, Bartholomew, and other disciples claimed to see the bodily resurrected Jesus Christ, and also to have physical contact with his crucifixion wounds. All of this was reported by the original disciple John, who witnessed the events. Ehrman claims that we don't know how they died, and Ehrman doesn't give proof of other oral traditions that compete, equally claiming that they actually lived a long life without martyrdom. and he says that he is only sure about Peter's martyrdom. Peter could not have been lied to. He extensively claimed that Jesus Christ is risen in his letters, and those who knew him, Paul and John, ensured that he explicitly claimed to witness the risen Christ. Empty tomb. Most scholars accept the fact that Jesus' tomb was empty 3 days after his crucifixion. We can also know it because the Jewish authorities accepted the fact of the empty tomb when the resurrection rumors started to spread. The Jews, instead of denying, they accused the disciples of stealing his body, as skeptics still say nowadays. This is a problem. Suddenly, after those 3 days, his body disappeared. The only reasonable explanation is that the reason for the empty tomb must be what the apostles claimed to see and died for. The most used alternative theory is the stolen body theory, the most common one. We also have the swan theory, the hypothesis that Jesus survived crucifixion, and the wrong tomb theory that claims that they have mistaken the tomb. The stolen body theory is the most common objection by skeptics. It basically explains the empty tomb by claiming that maybe the disciples stole Jesus' body 3 days later to appear like he was raised from the dead and fulfilling the prophecy. Here's my response. If they stole his body, they would 100% know that Christianity is completely false, and they wouldn't get their heads chopped off and hang on a cross for something they knew was false. If they stole the body, they would already know that Jesus was not raised from the dead, and that Christianity was not true, and they wouldn't die for the faith in something they knew it's a forgery since they supposedly forged it. Stealing his body would be harder than stealing a high-security bank nowadays. Let's now focus on how Jesus' tomb was sealed. It was sealed with a heavy stone that weighed between 1.5 and 2 tons. They needed to move something heavier than a black rhino to brutally die for a lie. But who cares? This sounds fun and motivating, right? Wait, this is just the beginning. There was also a unit of armed Roman soldiers, between 4 and 16 Roman soldiers, to protect the tomb from being stolen from day 1 to day 3, as the prophecy said. And whoever got caught sleeping or misdoing their job was going to be executed right away. There's almost no chance the disciples could sneak in. You could say that maybe they could kill them silently, like John Wick. But the unit didn't die as soon as the body disappeared. Romans did not desire Christianity to explode until the 4th century, when it became at least legal. So they had to ensure that Jesus' body wasn't stolen until the 3rd day at least, as the prophecy predicted that will happen. There is another objection that says that Paul didn't write anything about the empty tomb, therefore the tomb wasn't empty. That doesn't make sense. Why would he talk about something he didn't see? He wasn't in Jerusalem in the first place. Why would he talk about the empty tomb if all he saw was the risen Jesus and not Jesus in the tomb or near the tomb? When Paul witnessed the risen Jesus, it was a personal experience, but his companions heard a weird sound in the road. This noise was extraordinary enough for them to comment. I think that the lack of the detail of the empty tomb in Paul's letter just proves it's authentic. All 4 Gospels mention the empty tomb because they could testify it, unlike Paul. If Paul mentioned the empty tomb, I could presume that it is possible that it was an organized lie. It actually turns out to be proof that it's an authentic, independent eyewitness testimony. A large amount of simultaneous vivid hallucinations involving a large group of different non-family members of Jesus Christ is not the type of thing that you could safely presume while wanting to be taken seriously. It claims that Paul, the apostle, when he persecuted Christians, he felt guilty about that, and for that he hallucinated because of his guilt, and then he converted to Christianity. But what Paul wrote indicates the opposite. He couldn't care less about them. Unfortunately, before the resurrection day, we are sure that he thought he did the right thing and nothing convinced him before. So no, I don't think he felt guilty and hallucinated the risen Christ. Now let's talk about the second objection. There's already a problem here because I couldn't see much good quality content in the most accepted theory by skeptic scholarship. And now we are on swoon theory, which is almost totally rejected by both conservative and skeptic scholars. Romans were masters at executing. Jesus was whipped, beaten, nailed to the cross, and after he died, they threw a spear just to assure he wouldn't survive. They checked if Jesus was dead before putting him in his tomb. Even if somehow Jesus survived the crucifixion, he would be needing immediate medical care, and it will be obvious for the disciples that he wasn't risen from the dead, but rather he just survived from crucifixion while he was severely injured, and he would not convince his disciples that he is the Prince of Life and that he conquered death. The third theory is also widely rejected by historians and both liberal and conservative scholars from all religions. The wrong tomb is the objection to the empty tomb argument that says that the tomb checked that was found empty could also not belong to Jesus, and that perhaps they have mistaken the tomb. Mary Magdalene witnessed the burial of Jesus, and she found his tomb empty on the third day. The tomb's locality was known. Authorities could have easily found the tomb to disprove Christianity. They couldn't do it because they knew it was Jesus' tomb. The only option left was accusing the disciples of theft. It assumes that all the women, disciples, guards, and authorities mistook the tomb at the same time. We have early Jewish anti-Christian documents outside of the Bible that accuse the disciples of robbery, proving that the tomb was empty. These books are found in the collection called Toledot Yeshu. This collection is composed of gospel parodies about the life of Jesus that ridicules Christianity, but the funny part is that it's a tool to prove the Christian faith.
In the Toledot Yeshu, they confirmed that the tomb was empty, and it's an anti-Christian writing. It acknowledges the empty tomb and tries to explain it by saying that a gardener moved Jesus' body and hid it. The part where they use a gardener to justify Jesus' body not being in the tomb is on the very oldest layer of the entire Toledot Yeshu tradition. We already had the Gospel saying that they accused the disciples of stealing Jesus' body instead of denying it. And some skeptics, when they hear that they need something else to win, and they say that the Gospels lied about this video shows how the Gospels are reliable. But anyway, if the Gospels invented the accusations to be evidence for the empty tomb, then why is the Toledot Yeshu, which is a parody of Jesus' life relying on different enemy testimonies and rabbinic Jewish tradition, instead of early Christian tradition saying the same thing? When the opposers of Christianity, who were religiously Jewish, tried to explain it with other ways, instead of making it easier and saying it wasn't empty, because by saying that it would deny every tradition that was close enough to attest. The Jewish tradition that opposed Christianity confirms the empty tomb. The early Christian tradition does. The Roman pagan tradition does, as we can confirm with Celsus and Porphyry. All of them offer different explanations, like his body was stolen, he or someone used sorcery, or he is risen, that confirm the fact that the tomb was empty on the third day. The skeptic denial of the resurrection only came in modern skepticism there. There was absolutely no tradition in the ancient world that claimed Jesus' flesh or bones were still sitting inside his tomb. Most independent historians consider the ancient hostile traditions to be more trustable regarding the existence of the empty tomb. If we understand the circumstances of how hard it was to open the tomb, as we're going to do later, the gardener explanation is literally impossible.
Anyway, if his tomb was not empty, the Roman and Jewish authorities could have easily stopped the Christian movement by displaying his body publicly. Once again, it's acknowledged by most modern scholars, Christians and non-Christians, that the tomb of Jesus Christ was found empty a few days after his crucifixion. Apologia says that the stolen body theory claims are in Matthew, but not in the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark. According to Apologia, Matthew addresses the stolen body theory and creates a false scenario of accusation to make us think that the empty tomb is a fact. But Matthew is a first-hand witness on that. This is an argument from silence. The conclusion that the stolen body argument emerged between the Gospel of Mark and Matthew just because the earliest Gospel did not mention the stolen body theory and that the Gospel of Matthew does, that comes from an eyewitness and portraying the action not as something that came later and Matthew wanted to discuss it, but as an accusation of the authorities in the morning of the resurrection. It looks like Paulogia is cherry-picking, because he says that it is documented only in the Gospel of Matthew but not in Mark, and leaves apart the information of the verses in the Gospel of Matthew, which are obviously vital because he is trying to use them to defend his point, but ignores crucial information, which is what the verses themselves said. He draws a historical conclusion that the empty tomb accusations emerged between the time Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel was written, not due to what the Gospels said, but due to what the Gospels don't say. Josephus' historical conclusion. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, from a priestly family, confirms most stuff here. Jesus existed, Josephus confirms the Gospel's narrative, he was crucified, and the resurrection claims were early. We can confirm these facts in his work Testimonium Flavianum. He lived in the same city Jesus died and resurrected, and as I already said, he confirmed that James, the half-brother of Jesus, was stoned for the resurrection. But some people argue that the Testimonium Flavianum was probably heavily interpolated by Christian scribes because it doesn't sound Jewish. The Testimonium Flavianum was deeply analyzed by a Christian scholar with a PhD in Yale University who spoke Greek and Syriac. He analyzed the realizms used and the Josephine style of writing to see if all the Testimonium Flavianum matched the other works. The conclusion of T.C. Schmidt's book, Josephus on Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ, is that the Testimonium Flavianum should be attributed to Josephus more confidently because it's actually likely that there was no Christian interpolation and it's genuine. Can we trust the Gospels? Most stories of the Gospels are considered historically accurate, except the miracle claims and the resurrection claim in the Gospels. The problem is that claim that Jesus is bodily risen from the dead is a logical conclusion to what we know that is highly historically accurate. Bart Ehrman acknowledges the C.S. Lewis trilemma's conclusion. If Jesus claimed to be God, the trilemma is valid and true. But Bart Ehrman thinks that the Gospels added things to Jesus' sayings. What Ehrman believes is that the Gospels put words into Jesus' mouth with the admission that the Gospels are the only source for Jesus' sayings that are reliable. But Bart thinks that the Gospels are not always reliable. I'll put the clip for you.
Did Jesus think he was God? Throughout almost all of Christian history, his followers have said he was God, and so it's a logical question. Did he think so? I'm Bart Ehrman, and I've written a number of books dealing with the New Testament and the historical Jesus, including Misquoting Jesus and Jesus Interrupted. It's an important question, especially for believing Christians, but it's intriguing whether you're a Christian or not. Many Christian apologists today come up with proofs that Jesus is in fact God. One of the most famous proofs was expressed succinctly by C.S. Lewis. He asks, was Jesus who he said he was? There are only three options. If Jesus said he was God, he was either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. The logic is that if Jesus said he was God, he was either right or he was wrong. If Jesus was wrong, then he either knew he was wrong when he said he was God, or he didn't know he was wrong. If Jesus said he was God and knew he was wrong, he was a liar. If he said he was God and didn't know that he was wrong, then he was a lunatic. So if Jesus isn't either a liar or a lunatic, he has to be the Lord. He must be God. There's a problem with this argument. It's based on an unexamined premise. It assumes that Jesus called himself God. Did he? How would we know either way? The only sources for Jesus' sayings that are at all reliable are the four Gospels of the New Testament. But scholars have known for a long time that these Gospels are not always reliable in everything they relate. And so we'll have two questions. Do the early Gospels actually say that Jesus called himself God? And if they do say that, can we accept that as historically trustworthy?
Now we know that the Gospels show clearly that Jesus claimed to be God. John 17:5 is a direct quote from Jesus. "And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began." The issue is not if the Gospels, the only reliable source for Jesus' sayings, quotes Jesus claiming to be God. Rather, if the Gospels are always reliable. The main argument for them is that the four Gospels are a mix of facts and legends about Jesus' life. The problem here is that this conclusion is only obtainable with the assumption that if the events described in the historical biography are miraculous, which means that the events include actions that behave differently as they tend to do, it will mean that the historical biography includes some legends. These parts are not historical. What Bart Ehrman could affirm is that, by definition, a miracle is something very improbable to happen. In the Gospel's narrative, miracles are not a matter of chance. It's about if God wills it or not. When God performs miracles, it's because He wills it. It is a matter of, did He will it? How did He will it? Where did He will it? Why does He will it? And what does He exactly will? My metaphysical point of view is that Jesus is the designer of the universe, not the designer of the dice he rolled to create us. When he came down to the earth, he came here for a mission, not because the dice he rolled told him to go down the earth. Jesus performed miracles because he willed it, not because of probabilities. In theory, the Gospels are always reliable because it's written by first-hand eyewitnesses and top-tier historians with great contact with the eyewitnesses and investigations. We also believe that the Holy Spirit guided them, but I don't expect you to convert to Christianity because of theology, but rather because of the historical facts and likelihood. And practically, the Gospels are historically reliable due to its proven accuracy. Oral tradition is essential for the historical methodology. In the book Oral Tradition as History by Jan van China, it says, "Then I can assert what the uniqueness of oral tradition as a source is, and why, because of this unique character, we cannot ignore tradition as a source whenever it is available." And this book is not even about religion. Of course, you could argue that the Gospels contradict themselves, and even if they were historically correct, they're not anymore, because it has been changed. I will address the alteration accusation first. It's not a widely accepted fact that the Bible has been changed at least once. But the opposite is also not a fact. It's still a debated subject. The only verse added to the Bible that we actually have evidence for its addition is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Oral tradition transmitted the story to the scribes, and they thought it would be important to be in the Gospels. We are not sure if it was added. We only assume that it was added because there are no ancient manuscripts with this story. But it's still possible that we were unlucky and the story only stopped vanishing and rotting with the time on the manuscripts written around the 4th and the 5th century. But anyway, even though I would be totally okay if these verses were added, we are not 100% sure about it. If you got a little confused about how they render the missing parts with the early manuscripts, look at this on the screen. Let's focus on the most important. Was the message of the Gospels ever changed? I think that the content that supports the idea that the ending of Mark and other stuff was added by scribes is too weak. But the scribes' newer versions, like NIV, took verses out of the Bible because there are verses that exist in the KJV but not in the NIV. That's because NIV was not translated from the KJV, and the quote-unquote missing verses in the NIV are just verses that were not in the original manuscripts and that scholars didn't believe that they were in the Bible to begin with. But we are focusing on the message of the Bible, on the doctrine. Did it change over time? Some people say that the Bible must have been changed a lot because the surviving manuscripts we check to verify if it was changed are very early, but they are not the ones written directly by the apostles. But we can't assume something based on a document we don't have. We should assume based on what we have, and based on what we have, 99% of the Bible remains unchanged and no core doctrine anywhere was changed. Minor changes happen for sure. Sometimes Christ Jesus changed places with Jesus Christ and vice versa. Some insignificant differences occurred and we are aware of that. Based on what we have, the message of the Bible is unchanged. When a text that is considered sacred by large part of the population exists, the most unlikely thing is alteration, except if the greatest opposers to the faith are selected to be the scribes. We don't do guesswork here. The Gospels were trusted to trained Christian scribes. If the trusted scribes were Jewish, I would understand such unneeded awareness for some possible alteration. But the scriptures were preserved by trained devoted people who considered the scriptures to be holy. What if they did it without the intent of manipulating the gospel of Jesus Christ? That's the reasonable concern here. But if they unintentionally commit errors, the concern is way smaller and it has slight impact. The worst thing could happen is that some small errors could happen. For the sake of the argument, I will accept that the changes were way more concerning than the ones we actually see in reality. We can confirm that there was no change in the core doctrine and the commandments. If no essential Christian doctrine was changed, it would include basic teachings like Jesus' divinity, Jesus' sayings, that is the point here, and Jesus' death by crucifixion as a sacrifice for our sins. We can only stick to the alternative that the apostles added words to Jesus' mouth. But are they always reliable?
Can we accept that as historically trustworthy?
As Bart Ehrman questions, why do they contradict themselves then? They all align to the same conclusion from different perspectives. Jesus' sayings and Jesus' resurrection are both historical claims that are confirmed by reliable sources with great historical value and quality as a source. I've analyzed 24 supposed contradictions. I have not yet found a single one of them that could not be logically explained. It is clear that Bart Ehrman accepts the C.S. Lewis trilemma if the Gospels are proven to be always reliable. It's clear that the logical conclusion to the Gospels being always reliable is Jesus' divinity and resurrection. I really recommend Michael Jones' video in his channel, Inspiring Philosophy, called Are the Gospels Historically Reliable? Other objections to the resurrection were rebutted. We also have the theory that the resurrection is just a myth and that the appearances are just a legend that developed over the years. But again, the allegations appeared almost immediately. But now let's see what I call the less flawed response to the resurrection. Not because it is good, but because other responses are way worse.
And then there is the idea that Jesus was actually resurrected, that he physically rose from the dead. I have been around this planet, all over the planet. I've seen a lot of crazy things, but I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that people do not come back from the dead. I'm not talking about near-death experiences where they go into a coma-like state or their heart stops.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
I'm talking brain dead, dead. You're out, you're gone, 3 days, completely dead, come back to life, doesn't happen. It violates all of the laws of physics. There is no precedent for this happening whatsoever. The idea that somehow it's more plausible because it happened way back when stuff wasn't well documented, when we didn't have doctors and lab tests and stuff. Like, if God wanted to come down and convince people of something that is of that level of monumental importance that people actually believe it because all of their eternal souls is on the line, to do it in this remote part of the world and not have a shred of evidence for it. Jesus didn't write anything firsthand. We have no piece of anything that he built himself. We don't even have secondhand accounts of things that people wrote about him. We have stuff maybe fourth, fifth, sixth hand pseudepigraphal accounts written decades after the fact, and those don't survive.
We don't have those. We don't even have anything for pretty much a century until after he died. And it's like, this is the milieu in which the most important story is supposed to be passed on.
And this is the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful deity that then miraculously raised the Son of God to life. Like,
Don't waste my time. It's bullshit.
Can I see you as my curse? I will not judge.
Let's address every claim to make sure we don't miss a single one. I've seen a lot of crazy things, but people don't just come back from the dead. Congratulations, Mr. Kool-Aid. Maybe you just found out why we use the overwhelming historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection to prove that Jesus Christ is God. It's simply because more humans don't rise from the dead. If it was a normal thing, we would not use that as a solid proof for Christianity. We are trying to prove that Jesus Christ was not a mere human being with the overwhelming evidence for a no way out event that proves that he is divine. And now, Holy Kool-Aid is comparing the resurrection of Christ with events that are considered extraordinary, but just for mere humans. Imagine if it was normal for humans to rise from the dead, and the Christian says that Jesus was raised from the dead and therefore he must be God. The atheist would respond, "What's the deal? My grandma was raised from the dead last week. It doesn't mean she's God, if at least it was something extraordinary for us." But if the claim is that Jesus is a human and you've never seen any human being raised from the dead, therefore Jesus did not rise from the dead, the claim is an anecdotal fallacy. It's using your limited personal experience to claim that all human beings to ever exist cannot come back from the dead even if this human being is divine. It violates the laws of physics. This objection is a big misunderstanding of what the laws of physics actually are. These are observations made by humans, not something prescribing behavior. The laws of physics are descriptions that can be updated and proven wrong over time. They are not considered to be final and unchangeable. And the problem here is that we are not talking about the laws of physics generally. The subject matter here is the resurrection of the God made flesh. The laws of physics that this claim could seem to contradict are descriptions of observations. It's a matter of how things tend to behave. It's not how things must behave. The laws of physics are not something that fell from the sky, unchangeable and in its final form. It's a description by humans of how things tend to behave. We can also add some spice to Holy Kool-Aid's argument because some skeptics might also bring up what I've already said about the C.S. Lewis dilemma, that miracles by definition are events that its probability is low. I've already answered this plenty of times. The descriptions of the universe are a consequence of the existence of the universe, and the existence of the universe is also a consequence of the creator. God is greater than the universe, and the universe is greater than its observations. I'm not a coder, but I'll try to explain this with digital worlds. Imagine you are the best coder in the world. You create your game. It's basically your world full of characters. You have coded these characters to have a rational mind and to think. You can do this because you are skilled. They start noticing that the digital universe you have coded has a pattern. They describe their observations of the patterns they see. Their description is very accurate, by the way. In their world, they have seen that people cannot have blue skin and they cannot get upside down and fly with yellow eyes. As you are a skilled coder, you think it's funny to impress them, and you easily design a character with blue skin that flies. He's upside down and he has yellow eyes. That goes against how things tend to behave in your world. But it wasn't hard to make it. You can do this in your world if you want, even though it went against the descriptions observed by your in-game characters. What I'm trying to make you understand is that the all-powerful God of the universe can do whatever he wills. It's not hard to acknowledge this, or is it? There were no cameras at that time. We could interpret this as 1. God should have picked a time with cameras to rise from the dead. 2. There is no video, therefore it didn't happen. 3. There is not enough proof. I will answer each one. I find the second one an unlikely interpretation of what Holy Kool-Aid meant. And also, it's way too absurd to be something that Holy Kool-Aid would have said. Imagine rejecting everything that came before the cameras. I don't think he meant it. Let's first address the claim that God should have picked the time after the invention of cameras to rise from the dead. God chose specifically the 1st century, as we can confirm in Galatians 4:4. We don't need cameras to accept the resurrection. All we need is a little unbiased mindset. I think it's cute how Holy Kool-Aid is trying to tell God how's the best way to do his stuff, and how the consequence would be if God did this and that, while Holy Kool-Aid is just a flawed human at the end of the day. So why does he have to tell his creator how stuff should be going? This is a clear example of an informal logical fallacy, the Nirvana fallacy. The reason for that is because Holy Kool-Aid says that the resurrection cannot be true by presenting his idea of perfect and ideal solution to save more souls. If the argument is not that God could be the one to make the evidence for the resurrection better, but we don't have modern quality evidence for the resurrection, then I don't think it's Nirvana fallacy. It seems to be an argument from ignorance because it asserts that the resurrection is false because it has not been fully proven to be true. He's saying that it's not true because it has not been proven with modern quality devices, or he is proposing that God could have selected another time with cameras and made the evidence better. Either way, the argument is logically flawed because it relies on fallacy. But I'm pointing to fallacies on arguments that rely on fallacies. He also uses the fact that Jesus never wrote anything to sustain his claims. But if that meant everything we know about him is false, then Socrates, all this idea that he was some sort of philosopher, was a myth invented by bored people. Same thing with Buddha, Pythagoras, and Harriet Tubman. No writings recorded means nothing in history. After that, he says, "Don't waste my time. It's BS." Calling the argument BS is just a blatant appeal to the stone, ridiculing the argument and saying it's not worthy of his consideration in his own words.
Don't waste my time.
Is also the poo-poo fallacy, minimal facts approach. We have multiple independent sources supporting this historical claim by eyewitnesses. We have enemies supporting the empty tomb and former enemies witnessing the resurrection and radically converting. We have embarrassing admissions. We have the manuscripts from the eyewitnesses. We have confirmation from oral tradition. We have early testimony, such as the letters to the Corinthians supporting the claim. The apostles were either deceived, deceivers, or correct about the resurrection. Let's analyze it deeply. Deceived. In this scenario, they could not be deceived by other people because they were the ones who claimed that Jesus Christ is risen. The only hypothesis left is the hallucination hypothesis. It claims that their eyes deceived them. Deceivers. The apostles claimed that they saw the risen Jesus. If he was not raised from the dead, they were deceivers. But their martyrdom for the resurrection showed their sincerity. They died for what they witnessed. They claimed to be eyewitnesses. If they were not actual eyewitnesses, they were deceivers. But as I just said, they couldn't be deceivers because they risked martyrdom and died because of it. Multiple of the witnesses died for the resurrection. The apostles were not deceived nor deceivers. Correct. The last option is that they were correct and Jesus rose from the dead. Do you really think that suddenly, on the third day, the body of Jesus was not being in the tomb means that they stole it? You think that they went nearby Jesus' tomb and found already a full unit of armed Roman guards that secured the tomb with all their possible efforts, and somehow, let's guess, they became suddenly blind and the disciples moved a stone with 3,000 to over 4,000 pounds, massive limestone that is considered to be dense material, and it was locked in a groove, so they needed to push that heavy stone upwards to unlock it. You know what's even funnier? Most of them were like teenagers, and the only grown man there was Peter. Only Jesus and Peter paid taxes, which was mandatory for anyone over 20. It's very likely that the rest were under 20. The 11 teenager disciples plus Peter couldn't lift the limestone protecting Jesus' tomb. The tomb was intentionally secured to never be reopened again, just like a normal tomb. And after managing to somehow doing it, they could finally seal it to fake the resurrection and lie about their appearances to be arrested and brutally killed. Extreme risk because of the guards, nearly impossible to be less than medium risk. Extreme effort because of the stone and no reward at all. All of them were arrested, all of them suffered a lot, and all of them died with the exception of John, which also suffered but wasn't martyred. And that's it. If the fuel unit didn't manage to do their job and kill anyone that wanted to steal Jesus' body, they would be dead. The apostles being correct about the resurrection seems to be the only true option out of the three options. He is risen indeed. It follows logically that the Christian faith is true. Thus, Jesus Christ is God.